In the fall of 1991, two hikers were crossing a glacier in the Alps along the border between Austria and Italy. They were not archaeologists. They were not on a research expedition. They were just walking, and then they found a body. At first, they assumed it was a recent accident. Someone who had fallen. Someone who had not made it home. But when the authorities arrived and began to examine the remains, something felt wrong. The leather, the tools, the way everything had been preserved, sealed inside the ice, as if the glacier itself had been holding its breath for thousands of years. The body they had found was not a missing hiker. He was 5,300 years old. The man, now known as Ötzi the Iceman, is housed at the South Tyrol Museum of Archaeology in Bolzano, Italy, and what he carried with him into that glacier has never fully been explained. His copper axe was nearly pure copper, a metallurgical composition that researchers could not initially account for within the accepted technological capabilities of his era. His arrows were crafted with a precision that implied not just skill, but accumulated knowledge passed carefully from one generation to the next, refined over centuries, in a tradition we have no written record of. He was not primitive. He was not stumbling through existence. He was the product of a technology that had been developing, quietly and without interruption, long before we had been paying attention. That was the first signal. Move forward about 26 years. The year is 2017, and a team of researchers affiliated with the Pacunam LiDAR initiative is flying over the jungle of northern Guatemala. They are not looking for a single ruin. They are mapping. And the technology they are using, light detection and ranging, a laser-based remote sensing system, does something that no human eye and no previous instrument had been able to do. It looks through the trees. In 72 hours of aerial survey, the system returned data that rewrote the map of ancient Maya civilization. 61,000 structures, previously unknown, hidden beneath the forest canopy, roads, reservoirs, quarries, agricultural systems that would have required an extraordinary degree of coordinated labor and long-range planning to construct. The lead researchers, including Thomas Garrison of Ithaca College and Marcelo Canuto of Tulane University, described the findings in a way that was careful, measured, and deeply significant. They were not sensationalizing, they were simply reporting what the instruments had found. And what the instruments had found suggested that the population of the Maya lowlands during the Classic period had been grossly underestimated, not by a small margin, but by a factor of 2 or 3. 61,000 structures, forgotten, buried beneath centuries of unbroken forest. The instruments had been precise, the data had been clean, and the data said that we had been wrong. These two stories, a frozen man in an alpine glacier and a laser mapping a jungle from the sky, do not seem to belong together. One involves a single human being, the other involves an entire civilization. One occurred in 1991, the other in 2017, but they are part of the same pattern. Every few years, sometimes every few decades, a discovery surfaces that forces the scientific community to quietly revise a number, push back a date, or rethink a boundary they had drawn with some confidence. Not because the scientists were careless, not because the data had been hidden, but because the Earth is old, and the record it keeps is uneven and full of silence. What gets preserved is random, what gets lost is vast. A copper axe survives inside a glacier for 5,000 years. An entire network of cities disappears beneath a canopy for 1,000, and we build our understanding of the ancient world from whatever fragments happen to have made it through. This documentary is about what happens when the fragments do not fit the frame. Before we go further, if you are finding this journey through the ancient and the unanswered meaningful, this channel is dedicated entirely to these buried stories. Every week a new door opens into a world that has been waiting, undisturbed, for someone to ask the right question. If that sounds like something you want to be part of, consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you never miss a conversation. It means more than you know. Now back to the silence beneath the surface. Because the question this film is asking is not a small one. It is not asking whether one site was more advanced than previously thought, or whether one artifact was made with unexpected skill. It is asking something much quieter and much more unsettling. It is asking whether the story we tell about the rise of human civilization, the slow climb from stone tools to agriculture, to cities to writing, is the full story, or whether it is the story of the survivors, the fragments that made it through, the signals that were strong enough to reach us across the centuries, and whether, beneath the ones we have found, there are others still waiting, slowly, undisturbed, in the dark beneath the ice, and the jungle, and the sea. There is a hill in southeastern Turkey, about 8 miles northeast of the city of Şanlıurfa. It rises gently above the surrounding plain in the way that hills in that part of the world tend to do quietly, without announcement. Local farmers had known about it for generations. They called it Göbekli Tepe, which translates, without drama, as Potbelly Hill. For most of recorded history, nobody paid it much attention. In 1963, a survey team from the University of Chicago and the University of Istanbul passed through the area and noted the presence of flint fragments on the surface. They recorded it. They moved on. The hill sat there for another 30 years, largely undisturbed, holding whatever it was holding. Then, in 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt arrived. Schmidt was working for the German Archaeological Institute, known as the DAE, and he had read the 1963 survey notes. Something about the flint fragments had stayed with him. He came to the hill. He looked at the surface, and according to his own account, he understood within minutes that what was beneath that ground was unlike anything that had been found before. He would spend the rest of his life there. He died in 2014, still excavating. What Klaus Schmidt found beneath Potbelly Hill was a complex of circular stone enclosures, each one built around a series of massive T-shaped limestone pillars arranged in precise patterns. The pillars are enormous. The tallest standing examples reach approximately 5.5 meters, that is about 18 feet, and weigh somewhere in the range of 10 to 20 tons each. They are not rough. They are not approximate. They are carved. The surfaces of the pillars carry detailed relief sculptures of animals, foxes, vultures, scorpions, lions, snakes, and birds, rendered with a level of artistic confidence that implies long practice, accumulated technique, and a tradition of visual representation that did not spring into existence overnight. Several of the pillars have human arms carved along their sides, suggesting they may have been conceived as stylized human figures, beings of some kind, neither fully animal nor fully human. Radiocarbon dating of organic material found within the site placed the construction of the oldest layers at approximately 9,600 BCE. Some samples have returned dates pushing toward 10,000 BCE. To understand what that number means, it helps to have a few reference points. Stonehenge, in Wiltshire, England, began construction around 3000 BCE. The Great Pyramid of Giza was completed around 2500 BCE. The earliest Sumerian writing system, the oldest writing we have found anywhere on Earth, dates to approximately 3200 BCE. Göbekli Tepe was already ancient when any of those things existed. The people who built those pillars and carved those animals lived more than 6,000 years before the first stone was placed at Stonehenge. They lived more than 7,000 years before anyone in Egypt began planning a pyramid. And according to everything we thought we understood about how human civilization develops, they should not have been capable of building it. This is the part that stops archaeologists. The standard model of civilization follows a logical sequence. Humans develop agriculture, which produces surplus food, which allows populations to settle in permanent locations, which creates the social complexity necessary to organize large labor projects, which eventually leads to monuments and cities and writing. Step follows step. Each development enables the next. Göbekli Tepe does not follow that sequence. The people who built it were, as far as the physical evidence indicates, hunter-gatherers. There is no evidence of large-scale agriculture in the region at the time of the site's construction. There are no grain storage facilities, no irrigation systems, no evidence of the kind of settled agricultural community that the standard model requires as a prerequisite for a project of this scale. Klaus Schmidt himself came to a conclusion that was, in the academic world, quietly radical. He proposed that the sequence might be reversed, that perhaps religion or something that functioned like it, some shared system of belief and ceremony, came before agriculture, not after it. That the desire to gather, to build, to mark a place as sacred, might have been powerful enough to motivate the organization of labor and the development of new technologies, even in the absence of the agricultural foundation the textbook said was necessary. One theory suggests that Göbekli Tepe was not built by a settled community at all, but by a network of semi-nomadic groups who converged on the site periodically, perhaps seasonally, for ceremonies that required cooperation across a wide geographic area. In this reading, the site is not the product of a civilization, it is the engine that created one. Ian Hodder, an archaeologist at Stanford University, who has spent decades excavating the nearby Neolithic site of Çatalhöyük, has raised careful methodological questions about some of Schmidt's broader interpretive claims. The debate within the field is real, and it is ongoing, but even those who challenge specific conclusions do not challenge the dates, and they do not challenge the engineering. The pillars are there, the carvings are there, the radiocarbon numbers are what they are. Then there is the question of how it was built. The limestone for the pillars was quarried from bedrock outcrops, approximately a quarter of a mile from the site. At the quarry, researchers have found unfinished pillars still partially embedded in the rock, including one that, if it had been completed and extracted, would have measured approximately 7 meters tall and weighed an estimated 50 tons. It was never finished. It is still there, half-carved, still attached to the earth, as if the people who were working on it simply walked away one day and did not come back. The tools available to the builders were stone. There was no metal. There were no wheeled vehicles. There was no system of writing to record plans or coordinate labor across long distances. And yet the pillars were quarried, shaped, transported, raised upright, and arranged in precise geometric patterns that align, in at least some cases, with astronomical orientations that researchers are still working to fully understand. Archaeologists have noted that the manpower required to move a 10-ton stone pillar across a quarter mile of uneven ground, without wheeled transport and without metal tools, would have required coordinated effort from a significant number of people working together under some form of organizational authority. Conservative estimates suggest a minimum workforce in the hundreds. Some researchers believe the number was considerably higher. Where did those people come from? Where did they live while they worked? The area immediately surrounding the enclosures shows no evidence of permanent residential structures from the construction period. Whatever community built Göbekli Tepe left behind almost no trace of having lived there. What remains unexplained is the social architecture, the invisible structure of authority, cooperation, and shared purpose that made the physical structure possible. We can measure the pillars, we cannot measure what it took to agree to build them. And then, around 8000 BCE, something happened that no one has been able to fully explain. The site was buried, not by time, not by erosion, not by the slow accumulation of wind-blown sediment over centuries. It was deliberately and systematically filled in. The enclosures were packed with rubble, flint fragments, animal bones, and soil, and the entire complex was covered over as if the intention was to ensure that it would not be easily found again. It worked. It stayed buried for approximately 10,000 years. Stanford's Ian Hodder has described this deliberate backfilling as one of the most perplexing decisions in prehistoric archaeology. Why would a community invest what must have been an extraordinary amount of labor into building something, and then invest what must also have been an extraordinary amount of labor into hiding it? Some researchers have proposed that the burial was a form of ritual closure, a ceremonial ending to the site's active life, consistent with practices documented at other Neolithic sites, where objects or spaces are decommissioned through deliberate concealment rather than simply abandoned. Others have suggested that the burial was protective, intended to preserve the site against damage or desecration. There are voices outside mainstream archaeology who have proposed something more dramatic, that the burial was an act of intentional concealment, a deliberate effort to hide knowledge from someone, or from everyone. This interpretation is not supported by the physical evidence, and most archaeologists regard it as a projection of modern anxieties onto ancient behavior. But it is worth noting that the question itself, why bury something you spent a generation building, has not been answered to anyone's full satisfaction. In 2019, about 35 kilometers east of Göbekli Tepe, excavations began at a site called Karahan Tepe. The lead archaeologist is Necmi Karul of Istanbul University, and what his team has found there is deeply significant. Karahan Tepe contains similar T-shaped pillars, similar animal reliefs, and what appear to be human-headed sculptures emerging directly from the bedrock as though the figures are slowly rising out of the earth. There is also evidence of what researchers have cautiously described as a skull cult, carved stone heads, separated from bodies, arranged in patterns whose meaning is still being worked out. The two sites are contemporaneous. They share artistic conventions, engineering approaches, and a cosmological vocabulary that we are only beginning to decipher. They were not accidents. They were not isolated experiments. They were part of something larger. And here, at the edge of what the evidence allows us to say, this film pauses. Not because the story ends here, but because what comes next requires us to go back even further. Back past the stones, past the carvings, past the organized labor, and the buried temples, and the questions without answers. Back to a cave in southern France, where someone lay on their back in the darkness 17,000 years ago, lifted a torch toward the ceiling, and began to paint. Before we go there, wherever you are right now, whatever hour the clock shows on your side of the world, there is something quietly remarkable about the fact that you are here, in the dark or the half-light, letting a story this old find its way to you. Drop a comment if you feel like it. Tell us where you are and what time it is. There is something fitting about that thousands of people scattered across different cities and time zones, all leaning in toward the same ancient silence at the same moment. It is, in its own small way, not entirely unlike what may have drawn people to that hill in Turkey in the first place. Let us start with a number, 17,000. Not $17,000, not 17,000 kilometers, 17,000 years. That is the distance between the moment someone walked into a cave in the Dordogne region of southern France and pressed pigment against stone and the morning you woke up today. 17,000 years of wars, empires, plagues, revolutions, the entire written record of human civilization, every book ever printed, every city ever built and abandoned, every language that rose and faded back into silence. All of that fits inside that number with room to spare. And yet what was left on the walls of that cave is not what you would expect from the beginning of human creative thought. It is not tentative. It is not crude. It is, by any honest measure, extraordinary. The cave at Lascaux, in the Dordogne Valley of southwestern France, was discovered on September the 12th, 1940, by 4 teenage boys following a dog that had fallen into a hole in the ground. What they found by lamplight in the hours that followed has never been adequately explained. The Hall of the Bulls, the largest chamber in the Lascaux complex, contains paintings of aurochs, horses, deer, and a single rhinoceros rendered at a scale that fills the curved ceiling from wall to wall. The largest figure stretches nearly 18 feet across. The animals are painted in motion, their legs positioned with an understanding of anatomy and movement that any art teacher today would recognize immediately as the product of practiced observation. The pigments are ochre, hematite, and manganese dioxide, applied with tools ranging from simple brushes to hollowed bone tubes that functioned as a kind of early airbrush. The artists used the natural contours of the cave walls to give their figures three-dimensional depth, a technique that requires not only skill, but an understanding of how the viewer's eye interprets curved surfaces in low light. The oldest layers at Lascaux have been radiocarbon dated to approximately 17,000 BCE. Some sections may be older, but the paintings themselves are only the beginning of the question. In 1997, a researcher named Michael Rappengluck, working out of Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich, published a proposal that moved the conversation into territory that mainstream archaeology had not previously considered. Rappengluck had been studying a specific section of Lascaux called the shaft scene, a painted composition that has puzzled researchers since the cave was first opened to scholars. It shows a wounded bison, a figure that appears to be a man falling backward, and a bird perched on a stick nearby. The image is unlike anything else in the cave, stylistically and compositionally, and its meaning has never been agreed upon. Rappengluck's proposal was that the arrangement of dots and figures in and around the shaft scene encodes a star map. Specifically, he argued that 3 particular dots within the composition correspond to the 3 brightest stars of the summer triangle Vega, Deneb, and Altair in their correct relative positions as they would have appeared in the night sky during the Upper Paleolithic period. He went further. He proposed that a cluster of dots painted on the shoulder of one of the bulls in the Hall of the Bulls corresponds to the Pleiades star cluster, positioned relative to the painted figure of Taurus in a way that mirrors the actual relationship between those stars and that constellation. His findings were discussed in Nature and in Sky and Telescope. They were not dismissed. They were also not universally accepted. The debate within archaeoastronomy remains open. What is significant is not whether Rappengluck is entirely correct in every detail. What is significant is that a credentialed researcher, using standard astronomical calculation software to reconstruct the appearance of the sky 17,000 years ago, found a correspondence precise enough to be taken seriously by peer-reviewed publications. If he is right, even partially right, then the people who painted those walls were not simply recording what they saw around them, they were recording what they saw above them. They were tracking the sky across seasons, mapping the movement of star clusters with enough consistency and precision to encode that information in paint on stone. And that implies something that changes the entire picture of who these people were. 300 kilometers to the southwest, in the Cantabria region of northern Spain, there is a second cave that complicates the story further. Altamira. The ceiling of the main chamber at Altamira is covered with painted bison rolling, turning, curled into the natural hollows of the rock in compositions that use the three-dimensional surface of the cave ceiling the way a sculptor uses clay. When the cave was first brought to public attention by Marcelino Sanz de Sartuola in 1879, the academic establishment refused to believe that prehistoric humans had painted them. The images were too accomplished. The technique was too sophisticated. The prevailing assumption was that people living before written history were not capable of this kind of work. It took 25 years and multiple independent investigations before the scientific community formally accepted that the paintings were genuine and ancient. 25 years of a true thing being disbelieved because it did not fit the existing frame. The oldest sections of Altamira have been dated to approximately 35,000 BCE. The most recent layers, the famous polychrome bison of the main ceiling, date to approximately 14,000 BCE. The cave was in active use as a site of artistic and possibly ceremonial practice for more than 20,000 years. To put that in perspective, 20,000 years is longer than the entire span of recorded human history, from the invention of writing to the present day. Now hold all of that together and ask a question that archaeologists have been quietly wrestling with for decades. Why underground? The people who painted Lascaux and Altamira did not live in those caves. The evidence is clear on this point. These were not residential spaces. They were entered deliberately by people carrying light sources, moving through narrow passages, and crawling through low tunnels to reach specific chambers deep inside the earth. Some of those chambers are nearly impossible to access. There are sections of decorated cave walls in the Pyrenees region that require a journey of several hundred meters through passages too narrow for a broad-shouldered adult to move through comfortably. Someone made that journey in complete darkness, except for a small flame, carrying pigment and tools to paint images that no daylight would ever touch. One theory suggests these spaces functioned as sensory deprivation chambers, that the combination of darkness, silence, physical confinement, and flickering firelight was deliberately used to induce altered states of consciousness that were understood within the belief systems of these communities as a form of contact with something beyond ordinary experience. David Lewis Williams, a researcher at the University of the Witwatersrand in South Africa, has developed this interpretation in significant detail, drawing on neuropsychological research and comparative ethnography. His work is controversial in some quarters, but it has been widely engaged with in the academic literature. Another theory, less dramatic but equally interesting, suggests the caves were chosen for their acoustic properties. Certain chambers in Lascaux and other decorated caves produce unusual sound effects, resonance, echo, and reverberation that cause sounds made inside them to behave in ways that would have seemed remarkable to people without a scientific framework for understanding acoustics. Stephen Waller, an independent researcher, has published work suggesting a correlation between the location of cave paintings and the zones of strongest acoustic effect within cave systems. What remains unexplained is why both of these things might be true simultaneously, and what the conjunction of visual art, astronomical encoding, acoustic phenomena, and extreme physical inaccessibility tells us about the interior life of people living 17,000 years before the first city was built. There is a habit deeply embedded in the way we talk about prehistoric humans, of describing their capabilities in terms of what they lacked. No writing, no metal, no agriculture, no cities. The language of absence shapes everything, but absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, and the caves are a reminder that what survives is almost never the whole story. The pigments survived because they were underground, sealed from weather and light. The stone survived because it is stone. What did not survive? The songs, the spoken languages, the systems of knowledge, transmitted from one generation to the next through human memory and human voice, is simply gone. Not because it did not exist, but because it was made of breath and time. And breath and time do not leave fossils. Michael Rappengluck's star maps, if he is correct, are a fragment of a larger system of knowledge that someone, 17,000 years ago, considered important enough to carry deep into the earth and press permanently into stone. The question that this documentary keeps returning to is not whether these people were intelligent. They were. That much is settled. The question is what they knew, and how much of it is still out there, waiting beneath the surface of a hill, or sealed inside a glacier, or hidden in the pattern of dots painted on the shoulder of a bull in a cave in France undisturbed, slowly, in the dark. In the spring of 1901, a group of Greek sponge divers surfaced from a shipwreck site near the small island of Antikythera, between Crete and the Greek mainland, with something none of them could identify. It was a lump, roughly the size of a large dictionary, encrusted with 2,000 years of marine growth, dark and formless. The kind of object that most salvage operations would have set aside and forgotten, but it was extraordinarily heavy for its size, and when it was brought to the surface and eventually transferred to the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, someone noticed that there was something inside it. Not treasure, not gold. Gears, bronze gears, interlocking, arranged with a precision that made no sense in the context of everything else. Recovered from the wreck, wine jars, marble statues, glassware, the ordinary cargo of a wealthy Roman-era vessel going somewhere it never arrived. The gears did not belong to that world. They belonged, by every visual and mechanical logic available at the time, to a world that would not exist for another 14 centuries. The object sat in the museum. Researchers noted it. Papers were written, and then, for decades, it was largely set aside, not suppressed, not hidden, simply waiting for the tools that would allow someone to fully understand what it was. Those tools eventually arrived, and what they revealed changed the conversation permanently. In 2006, a research group called the Antikythera Mechanism Research Project, drawing together specialists from Cardiff University, the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, the University of Athens, and several other institutions, used high-resolution three-dimensional X-ray tomography to peer inside the corroded fragments without disturbing them. What they found was published in Nature that same year, and the findings were, by the measured standards of academic publishing, remarkable. The mechanism contained at least 37 interlocking bronze gears. Its front face displayed the position of the sun and moon in the zodiac, the phase of the moon, and the positions of the 5 planets known to ancient Greek astronomy: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. Its back face contained 2 spiral dial systems. One tracked the 19-year Metonic cycle, the period after which the phases of the moon repeat on the same calendar dates. The other tracked the 223-month Saros cycle, used to predict solar and lunar eclipses. A subsidiary dial on the back tracked the 4-year cycle of the Panhellenic Games, including the Olympic Games. In 2021, a further study by the Antikythera research team at University College London, published again in Scientific Reports, proposed a complete reconstruction of the front display mechanism, including a model of how the planetary positions were calculated using mathematical epicyclic theory, the same theoretical framework that Claudius Ptolemy would later formalize in writing, roughly 200 years after the mechanism was built. The mechanism did not just display information, it computed it. It was, in the most precise and non-metaphorical sense of the word, an analog computer. You turned a handle on the side, and the gears inside translated that rotational input into a coordinated output across multiple astronomical dials simultaneously. Days became months, became years, became eclipse predictions, all running in parallel, all mechanically linked. Nothing of equivalent complexity appears in the surviving archaeological or documentary record for the next 1,400 years. Read that sentence again, because it is not an exaggeration. It is the considered assessment of the researchers who have spent the most time with the object. The next mechanism of comparable gearwork sophistication that historians can confidently identify appears in medieval Europe in the form of early astronomical clocks around the 13th and 14th centuries CE. There is a gap of more than a millennium. A technology existed, functioned, was presumably understood and used by people who considered it useful enough to put on a ship, and then it vanished. Not replaced by something better, it simply disappeared from the record. Now, here is what makes that disappearance genuinely unsettling, rather than merely curious. The Roman writer and statesman Cicero, who died in 43 BCE, roughly contemporaneous with the shipwreck that carried the mechanism to the bottom of the Aegean, wrote in 2 separate texts about devices made by Archimedes that modeled the movements of the sun, moon, and planets mechanically. He described seeing one. He described it with the casual familiarity of someone referencing an object that his readers would find impressive, but not entirely foreign. Archimedes died in 212 BCE, roughly a century before the Antikythera mechanism was built, based on the current best dating of the ship's cargo. The connection between Archimedes specifically and the mechanism specifically has not been proven, but Cicero's descriptions make clear that the tradition of building such devices was known, named, and socially visible in the educated Roman world, which means the Antikythera mechanism was almost certainly not unique. It was likely one of several. It was the product of a tradition, a school of thought, a body of technical knowledge, a community of practice that had been developing for at least a generation before the object itself was made, and that tradition is gone. Without a successor, without a descendant technology, without even a clear explanation for its disappearance. One theory suggests the loss was institutional. The specialized knowledge required to build such a device, the mathematics, the metallurgy, the gear-cutting technique, was concentrated in a small number of people, possibly in a single workshop or school, and when that community was disrupted, the knowledge went with them. Wars, plague, the slow economic contraction of the Hellenistic world, as Roman power consolidated, any of these could have broken the chain of transmission without anyone intending to destroy anything. Knowledge does not require malice to disappear, it only requires discontinuity. One generation that does not teach, one library that burns, one workshop that closes, and a technology that took centuries to develop can vanish within a single human lifetime. What remains unexplained is the manufacturing process itself. The gear teeth of the Antikythera mechanism are cut to tolerances that modern researchers, even with the benefit of microscopic analysis and three-dimensional imaging, have not been able to definitively replicate using tools that would have been available in the ancient Mediterranean world. The angles are consistent, the spacing is regular, the bronze alloy is precisely composed. Someone knew exactly what they were doing, and we do not know how they did it. The reason the Antikythera mechanism matters to this documentary, beyond its own intrinsic astonishment, is what it proves about the nature of the problem we are examining. It proves that advanced technology can exist within a civilization, be used by that civilization, be sophisticated enough to require generations of accumulated knowledge to produce, and then disappear so completely that the civilization that comes after has no memory of it. Not a rumor, not a myth, not a vague cultural echo in a foundation story or a flood narrative. Nothing. 14 centuries of nothing, until medieval clockmakers independently rediscovered the principles of gearwork astronomy through their own slow process of trial and accumulation. If that can happen once, and we now have the physical object in a museum in Athens to prove that it did, then the question this documentary has been building toward becomes impossible to avoid. How many times has it happened? How many traditions of technical knowledge, accumulated over generations, have reached a point of genuine sophistication and then met a war, or a plague, or a fire, or simply the quiet failure of one generation to fully pass on what it knew to the next, and dissolved back into silence? Göbekli Tepe was buried. The Lascaux astronomical tradition faded. The Antikythera mechanism sank to the bottom of the Aegean and stayed there for 2,000 years. None of these were conspiracies. None of them required anyone to make a deliberate choice to erase the past. They only required time and forgetting, and the remarkable human capacity to build something extraordinary, and then, through no particular fault, to lose it. The world beneath our feet is full of things we built and forgot. And in the next part of this journey, we are going under the water because it turns out that some of the most significant real estate in human prehistory has been sitting 120 meters below the surface of the ocean for the past 10,000 years, and we are only now beginning to understand what that means. There is a particular kind of frustration that archaeologists rarely talk about in public, but that anyone who has spent time around active excavations will recognize immediately. It is the frustration of knowing something is there, having the data, having the readings, having every instrument pointing in the same direction, and not being able to reach it. Not because the technology does not exist, not because the funding has run out, though that is often a factor, but because the ground itself moves slowly and carefully and on its own schedule, and no amount of urgency changes that. At Göbekli Tepe, that frustration has a specific shape, the shape of 16 ring structures sitting somewhere beneath the soil, detected but untouched, waiting. When Klaus Schmidt began excavating Potbelly Hill in 1994, he understood from the beginning that what he was working with was not a single-phase site. The complexity of what was emerging from the ground, the multiple enclosures, the varying sizes of the pillars, the overlapping layers of construction and backfill, made clear that this was a place that had been used, modified, and added to over a very long period of time. What he could not have fully anticipated was the scale of what remained beneath the surface. In the years following Schmidt's initial excavations, the German Archaeological Institute conducted a series of geophysical surveys using ground-penetrating radar and magnetometry non-invasive techniques that send signals into the earth and map the density and composition of what lies below without disturbing a single grain of soil. The surveys, published in stages between 2012 and 2016, produced results that expanded the known boundaries of the site dramatically. The instruments detected the outlines of at least 16 additional circular enclosures beneath the current excavation level. Some of these appear to be larger than the enclosures already uncovered. Some appear to be at a greater depth, which in archaeological terms typically, though not always, indicates greater age. As of the most recent publicly available information, less than 5% of the total site area has been physically excavated. Less than 5%. The other 95% is still down there, untouched, undisturbed, holding whatever it holds. To understand why this matters, it helps to understand what the excavated 5% has already produced, and how radically it altered our understanding of the ancient world. The enclosures that Schmidt's team uncovered, designated enclosures A through D in the main excavation area, with additional lettered structures identified, subsequently represent what researchers currently believe are the younger phases of the site's construction. They are, in the logic of archaeological stratigraphy, the top of the pile. The deeper layers, the ones the radar has detected but no trowel has yet reached, predate what we have already found. Radiocarbon dating of organic material from the currently excavated layers has returned dates clustering around 9,600 to 8,200 BCE for the main construction phases. The deeper, unexcavated layers remain undated, because dating requires physical samples, and physical samples require excavation. What we know is that the site's construction timeline already spans approximately 2,000 years based on the layers we have accessed. If the deeper structures extend that timeline further, and the depth readings suggest they might, then Göbekli Tepe, as a site of continuous intentional construction, could reach back toward or beyond 10,000 BCE, possibly further. One theory suggests that the site was not built by a single cultural tradition, but represents accumulated construction across multiple generations of people who may have had substantially different relationships to the space, different purposes, different cosmologies, different understandings of what the place was and what it was for. In this reading, Göbekli Tepe is less like a single monument and more like a cathedral that has been built, modified, expanded, partially demolished, and rebuilt across 1,000 years, each phase adding layers that reflect the changing needs and beliefs of the community, maintaining it. What remains unexplained is whether that community remained continuous across those 2,000 years, or whether the site passed between different groups, each inheriting a space whose original purpose they understood only partially. There is another question that the excavation has raised and not answered, and it is one of the more practically puzzling aspects of the entire site. Where did the workers live? Building the enclosures at Göbekli Tepe, quarrying the limestone, shaping the pillars, transporting them from the quarry to the site, raising them upright and setting them in their stone-lined sockets required a coordinated labor force. The physical scale of the work is not ambiguous on this point. You cannot move a 10-ton stone pillar with 3 people. Conservative estimates from structural engineers and experimental archaeologists suggest that the labor required to construct a single enclosure, from quarrying to completion, would have occupied a workforce of several hundred people for a period of months. Systematic survey of the area surrounding the enclosures has not revealed evidence of large-scale permanent residential settlement from the construction period. There are no foundations of dwellings, no refuse middens of the size you would expect from a community of hundreds, no evidence of the kind of sustained daily life that leaves the dense, layered archaeological signature of a village or camp. Archaeologists have noted this absence without being able to fully explain it. One possibility is that the workers were genuinely semi-nomadic and traveled to the site for specific construction events, living in temporary structures made of organic materials, wood, hide, woven plant fiber that left no trace in the archaeological record. Another possibility is that the residential areas exist but lie outside the survey boundaries in locations that have not yet been systematically investigated. A third possibility, which several researchers have raised in careful academic language, is that the organizational model behind Göbekli Tepe's construction was fundamentally different from anything we currently have a good analogy for. That the social structures which made this project possible do not map neatly onto either the nomadic band or the settled agricultural village, and that we are, in a real sense, trying to understand a form of human organization using categories that were not designed for it. 35 kilometers to the east, a discovery made in the last several years has begun to reframe the entire question of what Göbekli Tepe represents in its regional context. Karahan Tepe. Excavations at Karahan Tepe began in earnest in 2019, led by Necmi Karul of Istanbul University, and the findings have been significant enough that the Turkish government has incorporated it into a broader initiative called the Taştepeler Project, Stone Hills, which is coordinating the investigation of at least a dozen related Neolithic sites across the Şanlıurfa region simultaneously. Karahan Tepe shares with Göbekli Tepe the T-shaped pillars, the animal reliefs, and the circular enclosure architecture that has come to define this tradition. But it also contains elements that have no direct parallel at Göbekli Tepe, and those differences are telling. Among the most striking findings at Karahan Tepe is a chamber in which multiple stone phalluses emerge directly from the bedrock floor, not placed there, not carved separately and installed, but shaped out of the living rock, as if they are growing from the earth itself. In the same area, a realistic human head emerges from the stone in a similar fashion, the face fully carved, the features distinct, the neck descending back into the uncarved bedrock below. Archaeologists have noted that this technique carving figures as though they are partially submerged in or emerging from the natural rock suggests a cosmological framework in which the boundary between the human world and whatever lies beneath it was not fixed. The rock was not raw material to be shaped. The rock was a threshold. What remains unexplained is the relationship between the two sites in terms of function. Were they complementary, each serving a different ritual or social purpose within a shared regional tradition? Were they competitive, built by neighboring groups who shared a visual vocabulary but served different communities? Or were they, in some sense we have not yet conceptualized, with Göbekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe as two nodes in a network that included all 12 of the Taştepeler sites, and possibly more? There is a debate within professional archaeology that rarely surfaces in public discussions of Göbekli Tepe, and it is worth addressing directly because it is relevant to how we interpret everything else. Stanford's Ian Hodder, whose decades of work at Çatalhöyük have made him one of the most methodologically influential archaeologists working in the Neolithic Near East, has raised specific concerns about the interpretive framework that Klaus Schmidt applied to Göbekli Tepe. Hodder has argued that Schmidt's thesis that organized religion preceded and motivated the development of agriculture rests on an assumption of clear functional separation between the ritual and the domestic that may not reflect how Neolithic people actually organized their lives. At Çatalhöyük, Hodder's excavations have revealed a settlement in which what we would call the sacred and what we would call the everyday were thoroughly intertwined, in which the skulls of ancestors were plastered into the walls of ordinary houses, in which the same space served as sleeping area, cooking area, and site of ritual activity. The clean distinction between a ceremonial center and a residential settlement may be a modern analytical category that ancient people would not have recognized. If Hodder is right, then the absence of residential structures near Göbekli Tepe's enclosures may not mean what Schmidt thought it meant. It may not mean that the site was exclusively ceremonial at all. It may mean that we have not yet found the full picture, or that the picture does not divide the way our categories expect it to. This is not a conspiracy. This is science. This is what the process looks like from the inside. Two serious researchers, both with significant bodies of work behind them, looking at overlapping evidence and reaching different interpretive conclusions, each of which changes what the other sites in this documentary mean. What the ground-penetrating radar has told us, with the neutral certainty of reflected signal and processed data, is this. There is more. Beneath the 5% we have uncovered, beneath the enclosures and the pillars and the buried rubble and the carved animals and the unanswered questions, there are 16 additional structures waiting in the dark. They have been there for 10,000 years. They will still be there when the next generation of archaeologists arrives with better tools and more refined questions. The hill is not finished speaking. It has barely begun. Start with a simple fact that most history books do not pause long enough to absorb. During the last glacial maximum, the peak of the most recent ice age, which occurred approximately 20,000 years ago, global sea levels were somewhere between 100 and 130 meters lower than they are today. Not a few meters, not a modest difference you could wade across. 130 meters, the equivalent of a 40-story building, measured downward from the current shoreline, outward across what is now open ocean. What that means, in practical geographic terms, is that the coastlines of every continent on Earth looked fundamentally different. Land that is now submerged beneath the Persian Gulf, the South China Sea, the North Sea, the continental shelf off the eastern coast of North America, all of it was dry, walkable, livable, and in many cases, it was the most desirable real estate available to the people of that era, for the same reason that coastal land has always attracted human settlement. Concentrated food resources, moderate climate buffered by proximity to the ocean. The people who lived on those shores built their lives there. And then, over a period of roughly 10,000 years, from approximately 18,000 BCE to approximately 8,000 BCE, the ice melted, the water rose, and everything they had built went under. We have been doing archaeology on the wrong 10% of the available surface. The implications of this are not theoretical. They are measurable. Bernhard Fleming and colleagues at MARUM, the Center for Marine Environmental Sciences at the University of Bremen, have produced detailed paleogeographic reconstructions, maps of what the world's coastlines looked like at various points during and after the last ice age, and what those maps show is consistently striking. In the region of the North Sea, between what is now the eastern coast of England and the western coast of continental Europe, there existed a landmass that geologists and archaeologists now call Doggerland. At its largest extent, around 15,000 BCE, Doggerland was larger than the United Kingdom. It had rivers, it had wetlands, it had what the paleogeographic evidence suggests was an extraordinarily rich environment, the kind of landscape that, in terms of available food resources and navigable waterways, would have supported a substantial human population. Doggerland began flooding as the ice retreated. By approximately 8,000 BCE, it had been reduced to a low-lying plain and a series of shrinking islands. Then, around 6200 BCE, a massive underwater landslide off the coast of Norway, now known as the Storige Slide, generated a tsunami that geologists estimate reached heights of 20 to 25 meters along the coastlines of what are now Scotland, Norway. Whatever remained of Doggerland above water at that point was almost certainly inundated within hours. Fishing trawlers working the Dogger Bank, the shallow elevated area in the central North Sea that represents the last remnant of Doggerland above the current seafloor, have been pulling up fragments of ancient peat, worked flint tools, and animal bones from the bottom for over a century. These are not isolated finds. They are consistent, repeated, and distributed across a wide area. What remains unexplained is why, despite decades of systematic trawling and increasingly sophisticated marine survey technology, no structural remains, no post holes, no hearthstones, no preserved foundations have yet been identified on the Dogger Bank. The organic and lithic evidence is there. The architecture is not. Whether this reflects the destructive force of the Storegga tsunami, the grinding action of subsequent glacial activity, the limitations of current survey technology, or simply the fact that the most promising areas have not yet been targeted, remains an open question. On the other side of the world, in the Gulf of Kambat, off the northwestern coast of India, a different kind of discovery was made in 2001. India's National Institute of Ocean Technology, NIOT, was conducting routine acoustic surveys of the Gulf's seafloor when their instruments returned anomalous readings at a depth of approximately 40 meters. The patterns in the data were not consistent with natural geological formation. They were geometric, rectilinear, the kind of patterns that, in terrestrial archaeology, would immediately suggest the presence of constructed walls or foundations. The NIOT team deployed underwater cameras and recovery equipment. What came up from the seafloor included worked stone artifacts, wood fragments, and what appeared to be pottery. One piece of recovered wood was submitted for radiocarbon dating. The date returned was approximately 9,500 years before the present. The announcement generated significant attention and considerable controversy. Mainstream archaeologists raised legitimate methodological concerns about the reliability of underwater context, about the possibility that recovered artifacts had been transported to the site by river current rather than left there by inhabitants, about the gap between finding artifacts at a location and demonstrating that a settlement existed there. These concerns have not been fully resolved. The dating of the wood sample has been disputed. No peer-reviewed publication presenting comprehensive stratigraphic analysis of the Gulf of Kambat site has yet established the kind of evidentiary foundation that would allow firm conclusions. Archaeologists have noted, however, that the Gulf of Kambat sits at the mouth of river systems that flow from one of the most archaeologically significant regions of South Asia, the area where the Indus Valley civilization would later develop, beginning around 3000 BCE. If a pre-Indus coastal settlement did exist in the Gulf before the sea level rise submerged it, it would not be anomalous in terms of geographic logic. It would simply be consistent with the broader pattern of coastal habitation that the paleogeographic evidence predicts. The site awaits the kind of systematic, methodologically rigorous underwater archaeological investigation that would allow it to be properly evaluated. Until that investigation occurs, the Gulf of Kambat remains neither proven nor disproven a candidate, sitting 40 meters underwater. Patient, off the southern coast of Japan, near the island of Yonaguni, there is an underwater rock formation that has been generating a quieter but equally persistent debate since it was first documented by divers in 1986. The Yonaguni monument sits at a depth of between 5 and 40 meters and consists of a series of flat-topped, sharp-edged stone terraces, angular platforms, and what appear to be carved steps cut into solid bedrock. The formation extends approximately 150 meters in length and 27 meters in height. Its corners are sharp. Its surfaces are largely flat. Several features, including what divers have described as a broad staircase-like structure and a formation resembling a ceremonial arch, have an angular regularity that is difficult to account for through purely natural geological processes. Masaki Kimura, a marine geologist at the University of the Ryukyus, who has dived the site more than 100 times and published extensively on it, has argued that the formation shows clear evidence of human modification, if not outright construction. He has pointed to specific features post-holes, carved channels, and what he interprets as symbolic markings as evidence of deliberate shaping. The majority of marine geologists who have examined the site have reached a different conclusion. Robert Schoch of Boston University, who initially approached the site with an open mind and has significant credibility as the researcher who controversially redated the Great Sphinx of Giza on geological grounds, concluded after diving at Yonaguni that the formation is most likely a natural structure, its angular features produced by the fracture patterns characteristic of the local sandstone, combined with wave and current erosion over long periods. One theory suggests that even if the Yonaguni monument is entirely natural in origin, its existence demonstrates the kind of dramatic coastal and submarine topography that would have characterized many inhabited shorelines during the low sea level period, and that genuinely constructed sites of similar scale, built on similar coastal terrain elsewhere, could present a very similar appearance on the seafloor today. What remains unexplained is a feature that both sides of the debate have acknowledged: a large, flat-topped rectangular area near the monument's main face that shows a degree of surface regularity, difficult to attribute entirely to natural fracturing. Neither Kimura's interpretation nor Schock's fully accounts for this feature, to the satisfaction of the other. The honest position, which the scientific literature reflects, and which this documentary is committed to maintaining, is that the Yonaguni monument is a genuine scientific dispute between credentialed researchers examining the same physical evidence and reaching different conclusions. It is not a proven ancient city. It is also not a closed question. Graham Hancock, the British author whose books, particularly Fingerprints of the Gods, published in 1995, and America Before, published in 2019, have brought the concept of submerged prehistoric civilizations to a wide general audience, is a figure that this documentary cannot responsibly discuss without precision. Hancock's core argument that a sophisticated prehistoric civilization existed during the last ice age and was largely destroyed and submerged by the catastrophic sea level rise and possible cosmic impact events at the end of that period draws on real evidence. The sea level data is real. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis is a live scientific controversy. The underwater sites are real. The geographic logic of coastal habitation is real. Where Hancock moves beyond the evidence is in the degree of sophistication and geographic extent he attributes to this civilization, and in the interpretive connections he draws between disparate sites and cultures. In a widely viewed debate on the Joe Rogan Experience in 2023, archaeologist Flint Dibble of the University of Washington engaged Hancock directly on these points, arguing that Hancock consistently overstates the certainty of his conclusions and understates the extent of existing archaeological knowledge about prehistoric cultures. Both positions are worth understanding. What Dibble represents the institutional consensus that the evidence for a highly sophisticated pre-Ice Age civilization remains insufficient is grounded in methodology and the genuine difficulty of establishing archaeological claims. What Hancock represents the intuition that our picture of the prehistoric world is incomplete in ways that established archaeology has been slow to fully reckon with, is grounded in real anomalies and real gaps in the record. The most honest synthesis is this: the seafloor almost certainly contains the remains of ancient human habitation on a scale we have not yet systematically investigated. Whether those remains, when they are eventually found and properly analyzed, will reveal communities of hunter-gatherers and early agriculturalists whose capabilities we have underestimated, or something more dramatic, is a question the evidence has not yet answered. The ocean is not a vault. It is not hiding anything deliberately. It is simply deep and cold and dark and patient in the way that only geology can be patient, indifferent to our timelines, indifferent to our theories, indifferent to how urgently we would like to know what is down there. The tools for finding out are improving every year. LiDAR technology adapted for shallow marine environments, autonomous underwater vehicles capable of sustained survey operations at depths and in conditions that human divers cannot reach. Sediment core analysis refined to the point where a centimeter of compressed seafloor material can yield a detailed environmental history. The map is not finished. It has not even been properly started, and somewhere beneath the water, beneath the place where the land used to be, beneath the shorelines that people walked along 10,000 years ago, when the world was colder and drier and the sea was 100 meters further away, there are answers that we have not asked the right questions to reach yet. They are down there, slowly, in the dark, undisturbed, waiting for the instruments that are finally becoming sensitive enough to hear them. There is a test that stonemasons sometimes perform at certain ancient sites around the world, and it is one of the simplest tests imaginable. They take a piece of paper, a standard sheet, roughly 1/10 of a millimeter thick, and they try to slide it into the joint between two stones. It does not fit, not because the stones have been cemented together. There is no mortar, no adhesive, no filler of any kind between them. The stones simply meet each other with a closeness that a sheet of paper cannot penetrate. In some cases, researchers have attempted the same test with a human hair. In some cases, the hair does not fit either. This is not a metaphor. This is a measurable physical reality present at multiple sites on multiple continents, constructed by cultures that had no contact with each other, using materials and methods that we have not been able to fully replicate with the knowledge we currently possess. That is the question this part of the documentary is about, not who built these structures. We know, in most cases, who built them, not when they were built. We have dates, in most cases, that are not seriously disputed. The question is how. And in several important instances, we genuinely do not know. Begin in Cusco, Peru, at 11,400 feet above sea level, on a hillside overlooking the city that the Inca built into one of the most sophisticated urban systems in the pre-Columbian Americas, Sacsayhuaman. The name is Quechua, and the site is generally dated to the reign of the Inca Emperor Pachacuti, who ordered its construction beginning around 1438 CE. The structure served multiple purposes: fortress, ceremonial center, administrative complex, and its construction consumed, by the estimates recorded by Spanish chroniclers who arrived within decades of its completion, somewhere between 20,000 and 30,000 workers over a period of approximately 70 years. The lower courses of the outer walls are built from massive polygonal limestone blocks, some of which weigh an estimated 120 tons. They are not cut into regular rectangular shapes. They are irregular, many-sided, angled, notched, and they fit together in a pattern of interlocking geometry that distributes structural load across the entire wall surface rather than concentrating it at any single point. The largest single stone at Sacsayhuaman is estimated at between 300 and 360 tons. For reference, that is heavier than the largest stones at the Great Pyramid of Giza, heavier than the trilithons at Stonehenge, heavier than any stone used in any construction project in medieval Europe. It was moved from a quarry approximately 35 kilometers away. Uphill, researchers at the Peruvian Ministry of Culture have documented the joint surfaces of the Sacsayhuaman stones in detail. What they have found is that the contact faces between adjacent blocks have been shaped to fit each other, specifically meaning each stone was cut not to an abstract geometric specification, but to match the particular surface of the stone it would sit against. This implies that the masons were either working with extremely precise measuring and transfer techniques, or were physically fitting and refitting each stone against its neighbor through a process of iterative refinement, shaving material incrementally until the surfaces matched. Either explanation requires a level of technical control that experimental archaeologists have found extremely difficult to reproduce using the tools, stone hammers, bronze chisels, abrasive sand that are generally attributed to Inca construction practice. Move now to Egypt, to a site that receives far less attention than the pyramids, but raises questions that are, in certain technical respects, more difficult to answer. The Serapeum of Saqqara. Located approximately 30 kilometers south of Cairo, the Serapeum is a subterranean complex of tunnels cut into the bedrock beneath the desert, used as the burial place of the sacred Apis bulls from the New Kingdom period onward. The complex contains, among other things, 24 granite sarcophagi. Each one was lowered into a side chamber carved from the bedrock, placed with precision, and sealed in most cases with a granite lid weighing an additional 27 tons. The manufacturing quality of these boxes has been the subject of detailed measurement by several independent researchers. Most prominently, the engineer and author Christopher Dunn, whose technical background in precision manufacturing led him to approach the sarcophagi with instruments typically used in industrial quality control rather than archaeological survey. What Dunn documented, and what subsequent independent measurements have not contradicted, is that the interior surfaces of the granite boxes are flat to tolerances on the order of 10 micrometers, 10 thousandths of a millimeter across surfaces, measuring over 2 meters in length. The interior corners, where the flat surfaces meet, are square to a similar tolerance. to produce a surface that flat across that span in granite. One of the hardest and most difficult materials to work requires either an extremely sophisticated abrasive lapping process applied with extraordinary patience and control, or a cutting or grinding technology that leaves a consistent finish across the entire surface in a single pass. Egyptologist Mark Lehner of Ancient Egypt Research Associates, one of the most rigorous and respected researchers working on Old Kingdom construction technology, has argued that the evidence is consistent with skilled use of copper tools, combined with quartz sand as an abrasive, and that the tolerances, while impressive, are achievable through sustained manual effort over long periods. Lehner's position represents the mainstream archaeological consensus and deserves to be taken seriously. What remains unexplained, and what Lehner's framework has not yet produced a fully satisfying account of, is the interior of the sarcophagi. Dunn and others have noted that the inside corners of the boxes show evidence of a rotary cutting action, circular tool marks suggesting that whatever removed material from those surfaces was rotating at the point of contact. Rotary cutting at this scale, in granite, using period-appropriate tools, has not been convincingly demonstrated in any experimental replication. The boxes are in the Serapeum. The tool marks are on the boxes. The explanation for how they got there is still being debated. Cross the Atlantic again and go south to the Bolivian Altiplano at an elevation of nearly 4,000 meters above sea level. Puma Punku was excavated and analyzed in detail by archaeologist Alexei Vranich of the Penn Museum, whose work established that the site dates to approximately 500 to 900 CE. Not ancient by the standards of Göbekli Tepe or the Egyptian Old Kingdom, but sophisticated in ways that the physical evidence makes clear. The blocks at Puma Punku are made primarily from andesite and red sandstone. The andesite, which is comparable in hardness to granite, comes from a quarry located approximately 90 kilometers away at the southern end of Lake Titicaca. The largest andesite block at the site weighs approximately 131 tons. It sits at 3,840 meters above sea level, 90 kilometers from where it was extracted. This alone raises significant logistical questions that have not been fully answered, but the manufacturing questions are what have drawn the most sustained attention. The H-shaped blocks at Puma Punku, a distinctive architectural element that appears repeatedly across the site, are cut with an internal geometric consistency that is difficult to explain through freehand stone cutting. The H-profile, when measured across multiple examples, shows a degree of dimensional repeatability, the same angles, the same proportions, the same internal recesses that suggests either a template-based manufacturing process or a degree of individual skill so uniform across different workers as to be statistically remarkable. The internal channels and recesses cut into the Puma Punku blocks include right-angle internal corners where two flat surfaces meet at precisely 90 degrees on the inside of the cut rather than the outside. Cutting a perfect internal right angle in stone, by hand, without metal tools, is among the most technically demanding operations in traditional stonemasonry. The Puma Punku blocks contain multiple such corners, consistently executed. Vranich and other mainstream archaeologists are confident that the builders of Tiwanaku and Puma Punku were the ancestors of the Aymara people, that they achieved what they achieved through organized labor, accumulated craft knowledge, and significant investment of time, and that invoking supernatural or extraterrestrial assistance is both unnecessary and disrespectful to the genuine accomplishments of an indigenous Andean civilization. On this last point, the documentary is unequivocal. The ancient aliens interpretation, which has been applied to Puma Punku with particular persistence by certain television programs and internet communities, is not supported by any credible evidence and attributes to imaginary visitors. What should be attributed to the ingenuity and capability of actual human beings who lived here, worked here, and built something extraordinary. What is not resolved by the mainstream position is the specific mechanism. We know who built it. We know approximately when. We do not have a complete, experimentally validated account of the specific tools and techniques that produce the internal right angles, the H-block dimensional consistency, and the surface flatness documented at the site. Taken individually, each of these sites has a mainstream explanation that is internally coherent and backed by serious researchers. The Inca were extraordinary engineers. The Egyptians had copper tools and abrasive sand and unlimited motivated labor. The Tiwanaku culture had craft traditions we have only partially recovered. None of these explanations require revision of fundamental historical chronology. None of them demand the existence of a lost civilization or an advanced ancient technology that has been deliberately hidden. But taken together, across 3 continents, across cultures with no documented contact, the pattern produces a question that is worth sitting with. The question is not whether these structures were built by human beings. The question is, what body of technical knowledge, accumulated over what period of time, through what tradition of practice and transmission, made it possible for human beings to do this, and why? In each case, that knowledge left so little trace of how it actually worked. Sacsayhuaman, the Serapeum, Puma Punku, 3 different cultures, 3 different materials, 3 different continents, 3 sets of engineering tolerances that current experimental archaeology has not fully reproduced. Archaeologists have noted, carefully and with the appropriate hedging that the evidence demands, that the ancient world was almost certainly more technically capable than our surviving record suggests. What remains unexplained is precisely how capable, and what it took to become that way, in a world that by every conventional measure should not yet have had the accumulated knowledge to do what the stones, quite plainly and unmistakably, show that it did. There is a category of ancient object that does not fit comfortably into any existing narrative about the development of human technology. Not because these objects are mysterious in the dramatic sense, glowing, impossible to explain, defying every known law of physics, but because they are mundane. They are functional. They are the kinds of things that, if you found them in a modern workshop or a contemporary laboratory, you would not look at twice. The mystery is not what they are. The mystery is when they are. These are objects that appear to demonstrate knowledge of chemistry, of metallurgy, of electrochemistry that the standard timeline of scientific development places centuries or millennia later than the objects themselves. They are not unique finds from a single anomalous site. They appear across different cultures, different geographic regions, different historical periods, and collectively, they raise a question that is easier to ask than to answer. What did the ancient world know about the material properties of the natural world that we think we discovered for the first time? Start in Iraq. In the 1930s, in the collection of the National Museum of Iraq in Baghdad. Wilhelm Koenig was an Austrian archaeologist working as the assistant director of the museum when, in 1938, he came across a group of clay vessels that had been excavated from a site near the village of Kujut Rabu, just outside Baghdad. The vessels were attributed to the Parthian period, roughly 250 BCE to 224 CE, and they were, individually, unremarkable, small, ceramic, the kind of object that fills storage rooms in any museum with significant Near Eastern holdings. But Koenig noticed something that had apparently been overlooked. Inside several of the vessels were iron rods, surrounded by copper cylinders, sealed at one end with an asphalt plug. He recognized the configuration. It was the structural arrangement of a galvanic cell, a battery. Koenig published his observation in 1940. His paper proposed that the Kujut Rabu vessels were ancient electrical devices, capable of generating a small electrical current when filled with an acidic or alkaline solution. He suggested they may have been used for electroplating, depositing a thin layer of metal onto another surface using electrical current, a process that in the conventional history of science was not developed until Alessandro Volta's work at the very end of the 18th century CE and the subsequent electroplating experiments of the 1830s. In the decades since Koenig's publication, multiple researchers have constructed replicas of the Baghdad battery using the same materials and dimensions as the originals. When filled with grape juice, lemon juice, or vinegar, all readily available in the ancient Near East, the replicas consistently generate between 1 and 2 volts of direct current. The electricity is real. The device works. The mainstream archaeological position, articulated clearly by the Smithsonian Institution among others, is that the most likely use for these devices was electroplating, specifically the gilding of small metal objects with a thin layer of gold or silver, a decorative and commercial practice that would have had obvious value in a trading culture. This explanation is internally consistent technologically plausible, and does not require the ancient Parthians to have had any theoretical understanding of what electricity was or how it functioned. Empirical discovery of a useful effect does not require a scientific framework to explain it. What remains unexplained is the absence of associated evidence. If the Baghdad batteries were used for electroplating, there should exist, somewhere in the archaeological record, objects that were electroplated using this technique, vessels or ornaments bearing the thin, even metal deposits that are the distinctive signature of electrochemical deposition rather than mechanical gilding. No such objects have been definitively identified in a Parthian context. The batteries are real. What they were used for remains, in the strict evidential sense, an open question. Travel now to India, to the courtyard of the Quwwat-ul-Islam Mosque in Delhi, where a column of wrought iron has been standing in open air for approximately 1,600 years. The Iron Pillar of Delhi. The pillar is 7.2 meters tall, weighs approximately 6 tons, and carries an inscription in Sanskrit that attributes its creation to a king identified as Chandra, almost certainly Chandragupta, the second of the Gupta dynasty, who ruled from approximately 375 to 415 CE. The inscription describes the pillar as a victory monument, raised in honor of the god Vishnu. It has been standing outside, exposed to the humidity and monsoon rainfall of northern India for 16 centuries. It has not rusted, not significantly. Not in the way that iron rusts. There is a thin, stable surface layer, a patina, but beneath that patina, the iron is structurally sound, its composition intact, its surface largely free of the corrosion that destroys unprotected iron in years and destroys most protected iron in decades. In 2001, Balasubramaniam of the Indian Institute of Technology, Kanpur, published a detailed metallurgical analysis of the pillar in the journal Current Science. What he found was that the pillar's corrosion resistance is not accidental. It is the product of a specific iron-carbon-phosphorus composition. The pillar contains an unusually high phosphorus content, derived from the particular iron ore and smelting technique used in its manufacture, combined with the chemistry of the Indian atmosphere, which cycles between wet and dry conditions in a way that promotes the formation of a specific compound on the pillar's surface. That compound is Mesa white, an iron hydrogen phosphate hydrate, which forms a continuous, adherent layer that effectively seals the iron beneath it from further atmospheric attack. Once the layer reaches a certain thickness, it becomes self-limiting, it stops growing, and the iron beneath it stops corroding. The Gupta-era smiths who made this pillar did not know about Mesa white. They did not have a theoretical framework for passivation chemistry or atmospheric corrosion dynamics. What they had was a smelting tradition, a specific set of practices for selecting ore, managing furnace temperature, and working the resulting iron that produced. As an empirical outcome, they may not have fully understood in mechanistic terms a material with extraordinary corrosion resistance. Balasubramaniam's paper notes that the specific forge welding technique used to construct the pillar it was not cast, but built up from many smaller pieces of iron hammered together, while hot produces a degree of structural homogeneity that modern iron manufacturing did not reliably achieve until the Industrial Revolution. Archaeologists have noted that the Delhi pillar represents not an isolated act of genius, but the product of a metallurgical tradition, the ironworking culture of Gupta period India that was, in this particular domain, operating at a level of practical sophistication that the standard history of materials science does not adequately credit. There is a third object, smaller and less famous than the Baghdad batteries or the Delhi pillar, but in certain ways more puzzling than either. In the collection of the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, catalogued under the unremarkable designation Cairo Object JE number 71,297, there is a thin disk of schist, a fine-grained metamorphic rock, approximately 61 centimeters in diameter. It was found in the tomb of a high official named Sabu at Saqqara, and it has been dated to approximately 3100 BCE, First Dynasty Egypt. Among the earliest periods of the Egyptian state, the Sabu disk. Its shape is the puzzle. The disk is not flat. It has been carved so that its rim curves inward and its center rises into a shallow hub. 3 curved lobes extend from the center, each one sweeping outward toward the rim in a form that bears a striking resemblance to. And this is where the interpretive debate begins. The curved vanes of a mechanical impeller or the spoked wheel of a very early rotary device. The mainstream position is that the object is a ritual vessel, a ceremonial bowl or plate shaped in imitation of a metal prototype, perhaps made for symbolic rather than functional use. This explanation is consistent with the funerary context and with the Egyptian practice of including symbolic objects in elite burials. What remains unexplained is why a ritual vessel would be carved into a shape this aerodynamically specific. The Sabu disk's curved lobes are not symmetrically decorative in the way that Egyptian ceremonial objects typically are. They follow a geometry that, if the object were rotated around its central hub, would function as a fluid movement device, channeling liquid or gas in a direction determined by the curve of the lobes. No consensus explanation for the Sabu disk's specific shape has been established. It is one of those objects that sits in a museum drawer, visible, measurable, physically real, and declines to fully explain itself. What connects the Baghdad battery, the Delhi pillar, and the Sabu disk is not a conspiracy. It is not a hidden history being suppressed by institutional archaeology. It is something more interesting and more challenging than either of those narratives. It is the repeated demonstration that empirical knowledge gained through observation, practice, and accumulated craft experience rather than theoretical understanding can reach levels of practical sophistication that our standard timeline of scientific development does not predict and does not fully account for. The Parthian craftsman who assembled the first Baghdad battery did not know Ohm's law. The Gupta ironsmith who built the Delhi pillar did not know the chemistry of passivation. They knew what worked. They knew it because generations before them had tried things, observed outcomes, and passed the successful techniques forward through practice and demonstration rather than through written theory. One theory suggests that this kind of empirical technical knowledge, residing in the hands and habits of craft communities, rather than in texts or formal institutions, is precisely the kind of knowledge most vulnerable to disruption and loss. When the community disperses, when the trade route closes, when the political order that sustained the craft workshop collapses, the knowledge does not migrate to a library. It simply stops being transmitted. And then, centuries later, someone in a different culture, working independently, discovers the same effect through their own process of empirical observation, and we call it an invention, and we assign it a date, and we build a timeline around that date that implicitly erases everything that came before. The artifacts in this part of the story are not proof of a lost civilization. They are something quieter and in some ways more unsettling. They are proof that the timeline has gaps, and that what fills those gaps is not necessarily absence. It is memory that did not survive the journey. Let us be precise about something before this part of the documentary goes any further. The word suppression gets used a great deal in conversations about ancient history, lost civilizations, and inconvenient archaeological discoveries. It is a word that carries a specific implication that someone, somewhere, made a deliberate decision to hide something, to prevent knowledge from reaching the people who would find it meaningful, to protect a version of history that serves some institutional or ideological interest. That version of events, the deliberate, coordinated, top-down suppression of archaeological truth by shadowy gatekeepers, is, in the vast majority of cases, quote, not what the evidence shows. What the evidence shows is more complicated, more human, and in certain respects more troubling, because it does not have a villain. It has a system, and systems do not need villains to produce outcomes that look, from the outside, remarkably like suppression. This part of the documentary is about that distinction. It is about the documented cases where inconvenient data was delayed, buried in unpublished notebooks, caught in legal battles, or dismissed by institutional consensus, not through malice, but through the ordinary friction of how large organizations, political interests, legal frameworks, and academic cultures interact with discoveries that do not fit neatly into existing categories. Begin in the summer of 1996, on the banks of the Columbia River, near the city of Kennewick in the state of Washington. 2 college students attending a hydroplane race found a human skull partially exposed in the shallows near the riverbank. They reported it to local authorities. Forensic anthropologist James Chatters was called to examine the remains, and what he found over the following days, as more bones were recovered from the eroding bank, was a nearly complete human skeleton. Initial examination suggested the remains were old, very old. Radiocarbon dating subsequently returned an age of approximately 9,200 to 9,300 years before the present, making this one of the oldest and most complete human skeletons ever found in North America. The skeleton became known as Kennewick Man, and within months of its discovery, it had become the center of one of the most contentious legal and scientific disputes in the history of American archaeology. The controversy had two distinct dimensions. The first was scientific. The morphological features of the Kennewick Man skeleton, the shape of the skull, the proportions of the face, the overall body plan did not closely resemble those of modern Native American populations. Physical anthropologist C. Loring Brace of the University of Michigan and other researchers argued that the skeleton showed affinities with populations from Southeast Asia and Polynesia, suggesting that the peopling of the Americas may have involved multiple migration waves from different source populations rather than the single founding migration from Northeast Asia that had been the dominant model. This was not a fringe claim. It was a serious scientific hypothesis with implications for understanding the deep prehistory of the Western Hemisphere. The second dimension was legal and political. Under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, NAGPRA, passed by the United States Congress in 1990, human remains found on federal land that are determined to be Native American must be repatriated to affiliated tribes upon request. 5 tribes from the Columbia Plateau region, including the Umatilla and the Yakima, claimed Kennewick Man as an ancestor and requested repatriation for traditional burial. The United States Army Corps of Engineers, which had jurisdiction over the federal land where the remains were found, initially moved to comply with the repatriation request before the scientific analysis of the skeleton had been completed. A group of 8 physical anthropologists filed suit to prevent the repatriation, arguing that the scientific value of the remains was extraordinary and that the connection to any specific modern tribe had not been established. The legal battle that followed lasted 9 years. During those 9 years, the remains were held in storage at the Burke Museum in Seattle. Access was severely restricted. Certain planned studies were delayed or prevented entirely. In 2004, a federal appeals court ruled that the remains could not be definitively linked to any existing tribe under the legal standard established by NAGPRA, and ordered that scientific study proceed. In 2015, a DNA analysis conducted by a team led by S.K. Willerslev of the University of Copenhagen, one of the world's leading ancient DNA researchers, returned results indicating that Kennewick Man was in fact most closely related to contemporary Native American populations, specifically to the Confederated Tribes of the Colville Reservation. In 2017, the remains were repatriated and reburied in a private ceremony. The Kennewick Man case is not a story about suppression in the conspiratorial sense. The tribes who sought repatriation had legitimate legal rights and deeply held cultural and spiritual interests in the remains. NAGPRA exists for important reasons rooted in a long history of institutional disrespect toward indigenous peoples and their ancestors. The scientists who sought access had legitimate research interests that produced findings, including the final DNA results, that actually resolved the question of affiliation more definitively than morphological analysis alone could have. What the case demonstrates, however, is that the intersection of scientific access, legal framework, political interest, and institutional jurisdiction can produce delays and restrictions on the flow of knowledge that, from the outside, can appear indistinguishable from deliberate suppression, even when no individual actor in the process intended that outcome. Consider a different kind of institutional friction, not legal, but academic. In the 1950s, a British archaeologist named Richard Atkinson led a series of excavations at Stonehenge that produced an extraordinary volume of data, notes, photographs, measurements, stratigraphic records, artifact descriptions representing some of the most detailed investigation of the site ever conducted. Atkinson did not publish a comprehensive report on his excavations. He produced preliminary papers, he gave lectures, he wrote a popular book about Stonehenge that became widely read. But the full excavation archive, the primary data that other researchers would need to independently verify, reinterpret, or build upon his work, remained largely in his personal possession. Atkinson died in 1992. His excavation records were not fully published until 1995. In a report produced by English Heritage more than 40 years after the original fieldwork, 40 years of primary data sitting in notebooks while the field moved forward without full access to it. Archaeologists have noted that this situation, while frustrating, was not exceptional for its era. The expectation in mid-20th century British archaeology was that the excavating archaeologist owned the interpretive right to their own data, and publication timelines were governed by individual capacity and institutional pressure rather than by any enforceable open access standard. The Atkinson case was a product of disciplinary culture rather than personal malice. But the consequence that an entire generation of Stonehenge research proceeded without access to some of the most detailed primary data in existence is a real consequence, regardless of how it came about. Now consider a case that sits at the opposite end of the credibility spectrum and requires precisely that placement in order to be useful. In 2005, a Bosnian-American businessman named Semir Osmanagic announced that a hill near the town of Visoko in central Bosnia, Visočica Hill, was not a natural hill at all, but a massive ancient pyramid, which he named the Pyramid of the Sunday. He claimed it was the largest pyramid in the world, older than the Egyptian pyramids, and evidence of a sophisticated ancient civilization in prehistoric Europe. The European Association of Archaeologists issued a formal statement calling the claim a combination of outright falsification and wishful thinking. Geologists who examined the hill concluded that its shape was the product of natural geological processes, specifically the differential erosion of a Fleisch formation, a type of sedimentary rock that commonly produces flat-faced, pyramid-like hills in the Balkans. Osmanagic has continued to excavate the site and to attract significant tourism and media attention. His claims have not gained acceptance in peer-reviewed archaeology or geology. The Bosnian pyramid is included in this documentary not to mock it, but because it serves an important function. It is a clear example of the difference between genuine institutional friction, the Kennewick case, the Atkinson notebooks, and the kind of fringe claim that the label of suppression is sometimes used to deflect from the absence of supporting evidence. When the European Association of Archaeologists rejected Osmanagic's claims, that was not suppression. That was peer review. Those are not the same thing, even when they produce outcomes that feel similar from the perspective of someone whose claims are being rejected. One theory, articulated carefully by sociologists of science rather than conspiracy theorists, suggests that large research institutions, universities, museums, government agencies have structural incentives to protect established theoretical frameworks that are independent of any individual's intentions. Funding follows consensus. Careers are built on the existing literature. Peer review, which is the essential quality control mechanism of science, is conducted by researchers who are themselves invested in the frameworks the new work is challenging. This does not mean that paradigm-challenging findings are suppressed. It means they face a higher evidentiary burden, which is, arguably, appropriate. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, but which also means that findings that genuinely challenge established timelines move through the system more slowly than findings that confirm existing models. Thomas Kuhn, the historian and philosopher of science, whose 1962 book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, remains one of the most influential works in the philosophy of science, described this dynamic in careful theoretical terms. He was not describing a conspiracy. He was describing the normal sociology of how scientific communities maintain and revise their understanding of the world. What remains unexplained, individual delays and disputes discussed in this part of the documentary can account for. The honest answer to the cover-up question is this: there is no coordinated global conspiracy to hide the true history of human civilization. There is no secret council of archaeologists deciding which findings will be suppressed and which will be allowed to reach the public. The institutions of academic archaeology are, in aggregate, populated by researchers who are genuinely committed to understanding the past as accurately as the evidence allows. What there is documented, verifiable, and worth taking seriously is a system in which legal frameworks sometimes conflict with scientific access, in which publication timelines can be measured in decades rather than years, in which institutional consensus creates friction for findings that challenge established models, and in which the line between rigorous peer review and conservative gatekeeping is not always easy to locate from the outside. The data about Kennewick Man was not suppressed. It was delayed by a legitimate legal dispute with no clean resolution. The Stonehenge excavation records were not hidden. They were held by a single researcher in a disciplinary culture that had not yet developed open access norms. The Bosnian pyramid was not suppressed. It was evaluated by the appropriate scientific community and found to lack supporting evidence. Each of these outcomes looks different. Each requires a different response, and the capacity to distinguish between them, to recognize real institutional friction without inventing coordinated concealment where none exists, is not a concession to the establishment. It is the basic intellectual discipline that makes it possible to take the genuine mysteries in this documentary seriously. Because the genuine mysteries are serious enough, they do not need embellishment. They only need the space to be examined honestly. 12,800 years ago, something changed. Not gradually, not over centuries of slow climatic drift. Abruptly, within what the ice core record suggests may have been as little as a single decade, average temperatures in the northern hemisphere dropped by somewhere between 10 and 15 degrees Celsius. Glaciers that had been retreating began advancing again. The vast grasslands of North America, which had supported enormous herds of megafauna for tens of thousands of years, began to collapse. Species that had survived multiple previous glacial cycles, the woolly mammoth, the American mastodon, the short-faced bear, the American horse, the giant ground sloth, disappeared from the fossil record within a geologically brief window of time. The Clovis culture, the earliest well-documented human civilization in North America, named for the distinctive fluted stone points found near Clovis, New Mexico, vanishes from the archaeological record at approximately the same moment. Geologists call this event the Younger Dryas. It lasted approximately 1,200 years, ending around 11,600 years ago, which is, as this documentary has already noted, almost precisely when the builders of Göbekli Tepe began cutting their first limestone pillars. The Younger Dryas has been known to science for decades. What has not been settled, what is currently one of the most actively contested questions in quaternary geology and archaeology, is what caused it. The conventional explanation, which held the field for most of the 20th century, invokes a mechanism called the ocean conveyor disruption. As the glaciers of the last ice age melted, the theory goes, enormous volumes of fresh meltwater were released into the North Atlantic, diluting the saltwater enough to slow or temporarily halt the thermohaline circulation, the global system of ocean currents that distributes heat around the planet. Without the warm water that the Atlantic circulation normally carries northward, the northern hemisphere cooled rapidly. The conveyor eventually restarted, the climate recovered, and the Younger Dryas ended. This explanation has the advantage of invoking well-understood physical mechanisms. It has the disadvantage of being difficult to reconcile with certain features of the geological record, specifically the apparent synchronicity of the onset across multiple continents, which is difficult to account for through an ocean circulation mechanism that would be expected to affect different regions at different rates. In 2007, a group of researchers led by James Kennett of the University of California, Santa Barbara, and Richard Firestone of the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory published a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that proposed a different mechanism entirely. They called it the Younger Dryas boundary impact hypothesis. The evidence that Kennett, Firestone, and their colleagues presented was geological rather than astronomical. They had identified a thin but distinct layer in sediment cores and archaeological sites across North America, Europe, and parts of the Middle East, a layer that consistently appeared at the stratigraphic level, corresponding to approximately 12,800 years ago. Within that layer, they found a collection of markers that they argued were diagnostic of an extraterrestrial impact or airburst event. Nanodiamonds, microscopic diamond crystals that form only under the extreme pressures generated by cosmic impacts. Magnetic spherules, tiny iron-rich spheres produced when molten rock is scattered into the atmosphere and rapidly cooled. Iridium enrichment, the same platinum group element anomaly that marks the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary, the layer associated with the asteroid impact that ended the age of the dinosaurs 66 million years ago. Shocked quartz, high-temperature silica glass, elevated concentrations of platinum. These markers were not found at a single site. In the initial 2007 paper, they were identified across 26 sites. By 2018, when an expanded study was published again in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, the number had grown to more than 50 sites on 6 continents. The markers appeared consistently in the same stratigraphic layer, in the same relative concentrations, across sites separated by thousands of kilometers and multiple continental landmasses. One theory suggests that the event responsible for depositing these markers was the impact or airburst of a fragmented comet, a comet that had broken into multiple pieces during a previous close approach to Earth or during its passage through the inner solar system, and which then struck or detonated above multiple locations across the northern hemisphere in a geologically instantaneous sequence. The energy released by such an event would have been sufficient to ignite continent-scale wildfires, collapse regional ecosystems, disrupt atmospheric circulation, and introduce the kind of abrupt temperature forcing that the ice core record shows at the Younger Dryas onset. Archaeologists have noted that the Younger Dryas boundary layer at Abu Huraira in Syria, one of the earliest agricultural villages ever excavated, investigated by Andrew Moore of the Rochester Institute of Technology, contains burned plant remains, melted building materials, and mineral grains, showing the kind of shock metamorphism that requires temperatures and pressures far beyond those of an ordinary fire. Moore's analysis of the Abu Huraira evidence, published in collaboration with members of the Younger Dryas Impact Research Group, suggests that the village experienced a thermal event of extraordinary intensity at approximately 12,800 years ago. The hypothesis has not gone unchallenged. Nicholas Pinter of the University of California, Davis, and several colleagues published a series of critical papers in the journals Quaternary Research and the Journal of Quaternary Science, arguing that the markers identified by Kennett, Firestone, and their group were not uniquely diagnostic of a cosmic impact. Magnetic spherules, Pinter's team noted, are produced by ordinary wildfires, volcanic eruptions, and industrial combustion. Nanodiamonds occur in certain geological formations without any impact mechanism. The iridium anomaly at the Younger Dryas boundary, they argued, is substantially smaller than the anomaly at the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary and within the range that could be produced by natural terrestrial processes. The debate that followed, conducted across multiple peer-reviewed journals over more than a decade, is a case study in how science handles extraordinary claims. Both sides have published. Both sides have been challenged. Both sides have responded to those challenges with additional data and refined arguments. The question of whether a cosmic impact or airburst caused the Younger Dryas onset is not resolved. It is alive. What remains unexplained, and what neither the ocean conveyor hypothesis nor the impact hypothesis has yet fully accounted for, is the simultaneous disappearance of multiple megafauna species across multiple continents at approximately the same moment. The Quaternary extinction event that coincides with the Younger Dryas onset eliminated more large animal species in a shorter period of time than any comparable event in the preceding tens of millions of years. Human hunting pressure. The overkill hypothesis has been proposed as an alternative explanation, and the debate between climate change, human predation, and extraterrestrial impact as the primary driver of the Quaternary extinctions remains unresolved in the scientific literature. The reason this hypothesis matters to the architecture of this documentary is not the impact itself. It is the implication of the impact for everything this film has been examining. If a catastrophic event, whether an extraterrestrial impact, an unprecedented ocean circulation disruption, or some combination of triggering mechanisms produced a decade-scale temperature drop of 10 to 15 degrees across the northern hemisphere, 12,800 years ago, the consequences for human populations would have been severe, not extinction. Humans survived the Younger Dryas. The archaeological record on every inhabited continent shows continuity of human presence through the event. But survival and continuity are not the same as preservation of accumulated knowledge. Consider what a decade-scale climate catastrophe, accompanied by continent-scale wildfires, ecosystem collapse, and the sudden disappearance of the large animals that many cultures depended on for food would do to a community whose technical knowledge resided primarily in living memory and oral transmission rather than in written records or durable, physical infrastructure. It would break the chain of transmission. Not everywhere, not completely, but in enough places with enough frequency to produce precisely the kind of fragmented, discontinuous archaeological record that this documentary has been documenting from the beginning. A tradition of astronomical encoding in cave paintings that suddenly has no one left to maintain it. A sophisticated masonry technique passed between master and apprentice for generations, ending when the masters do not survive to teach. A body of empirical chemistry, electroplating, corrosion-resistant metallurgy that exists in the practice of a craft community. Until that community disperses under pressure, it cannot withstand. One theory suggests that Göbekli Tepe, dated to 11,600 years ago, 1,200 years after the Younger Dryas onset, right at its end, is not the beginning of the story. It is the resumption of it, the first chapter of the recovery, built by people who were reconstructing, from fragments and cultural memory and inherited purpose, something of what had existed before the cold. This is the connective tissue that holds the anomalies of this documentary together, not a conspiracy, not a hidden civilization whose existence powerful institutions are working to deny, but a catastrophe, real, measurable, geologically documented, that reset the material conditions of human life across the Northern Hemisphere, interrupted the transmission of accumulated knowledge in ways that left precisely the kind of gaps and discontinuities we have been examining, and then receded, leaving a world that had to begin again. And beginning again is slower than continuing. What takes 1,000 years to build can take 1,000 years to rebuild, if it gets rebuilt at all. The ice cores from Greenland record the temperature drop. The sediment layers from Abu Huraira record the fire. The fossil record across North America records the extinctions. And the absence in our timeline, the silence between what the cave paintings at Lascaux suggest about the cognitive and observational capabilities of people 17,000 years ago and the first surviving evidence of organized civilization 6,000 years later, may not be a silence at all. It may be the sound of a world slowly, quietly, patiently putting itself back together. In 2015, a paper appeared in the Journal of Archaeological Science that received relatively little attention outside specialist circles, but that contained a finding significant enough to quietly reframe the way researchers think about the reliability of ancient oral tradition. The paper was authored by Patrick Nunn, a geographer and professor at the University of the Sunshine Coast in Australia, and Nicholas Reed, a linguist at the University of New England. Together, they had been examining a set of Aboriginal Australian oral traditions stories passed down through generations of spoken transmission across dozens of different language groups that described coastlines, islands, and geographical features that no longer exist above the waterline. They were not examining these stories as mythology. They were examining them as data. What Nunn and Reed found, by cross-referencing the geographical descriptions in the oral traditions against paleogeographic reconstructions of sea level change since the end of the last ice age, was that 21 distinct Aboriginal Australian oral traditions accurately described coastal features, specific bays, headlands, islands, and flooded river valleys that had been submerged by rising sea levels between 7,000 and 10,000 years ago. Not approximately, not in general terms consistent with a vague cultural memory of a wetter or drier period. Accurately, with enough specific geographical detail that the submerged features could be matched to known paleogeographic data. The paper's conclusion was careful and precise. Nunn and Reed were not claiming that Aboriginal Australians had kept perfect records across 10,000 years of oral transmission. They were demonstrating that the oral traditions of certain cultures can preserve empirically verifiable geographical information across time spans that are, by any conventional measure of information transmission, extraordinary. 10,000 years of spoken memory. In the absence of writing, passing through hundreds of generations of human lives, each one a potential point of distortion, loss, or corruption. And the coastline descriptions came through accurately. This finding does not stand alone. Geologist and folklorist Dorothy Vitaliano, who coined the term geomythology in the 1970s to describe the study of geological events preserved in mythological traditions, documented numerous cases in which ancient stories encode accurate information about volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, and landscape changes that occurred long before written records existed. The oral traditions of the Klamath people of the Pacific Northwest contain a detailed account of a catastrophic eruption and the collapse of a mountain, an event that geologists have independently dated to approximately 7,700 years ago through the volcanic deposits it left in, the regional stratigraphy. The mountain in question is now known as Crater Lake in Oregon, formed when the volcano Mazama collapsed into itself following the eruption. The Klamath account describes the event with a narrative specificity, the falling of the mountain, the subsequent filling of the resulting basin that is consistent with what the geological record shows. 7,700 years, transmitted in spoken language, through generations of people who had no instruments to measure what had happened and no writing to record it, and arriving at the present with enough fidelity that a geologist can match the narrative to the physical evidence in the landscape, which brings us, carefully and with appropriate methodological caution, to Plato. In 360 BCE, the Greek philosopher wrote two dialogues, the Timaeus and the Critias, in which an Egyptian priest tells the Athenian statesman Solon about a powerful maritime civilization called Atlantis, which had existed beyond the Pillars of Hercules and had been destroyed by the gods and sunk beneath the ocean 9,000 years before Solon's time. 9,000 years before Solon. Solon lived approximately 600 BCE. 9,000 years before that places the destruction of Atlantis at approximately 9,600 BCE, the same era as Göbekli Tepe, the same era as the end of the Younger Dryas, the same era as the most dramatic period of post-glacial sea level rise. The coincidence of the date has attracted attention from researchers across a wide spectrum of credibility, and it is worth being precise about what that attention has produced. On one end of the spectrum, the Atlantis of popular culture, a technologically advanced civilization with electricity and crystal power and psychic abilities, is not supported by any physical evidence and is not a serious scholarly position. On the other end, several legitimate researchers have proposed that Plato's account preserves, through the kind of multi-generational oral and written transmission that Nunn and Reed's work suggests is more reliable than previously assumed, a distorted cultural memory of real events. The most widely discussed candidate among mainstream researchers is the Minoan civilization on the island of Thera, which experienced a catastrophic volcanic eruption around 1600 BCE that destroyed a significant portion of the island and may have sent tsunami waves across the eastern Mediterranean. Plato's account, in this reading, is a conflation and exaggeration of real Bronze Age catastrophes passed through the Egyptian priestly tradition that Solon encountered during his time in Egypt. A smaller number of researchers, working within the framework of the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, have proposed that Plato's date 9,600 BCE is not an exaggeration but a genuine, if imprecisely transmitted, date for a real catastrophic event that affected coastal populations across the Atlantic basin. It is not without supporting logic. Given the geological context this documentary has established, it is also not proven. What remains unexplained is why Plato, who was writing philosophical dialogues rather than historical chronicles, chose to anchor his account to a specific date that places the event at precisely the most geologically turbulent period in the last 20,000 years of Earth history, and whether that specificity reflects a genuine transmission of ancient information, a philosophical choice, or a coincidence that the human pattern-seeking mind should be careful not to overinterpret. The flood myths deserve a moment of their own. Researcher James Fraser, in his 1919 compilation Folklore in the Old Testament, documented flood narratives from more than 200 independent cultural traditions across every inhabited continent. The Sumerian epic of Gilgamesh contains a flood account that predates the biblical narrative of Noah and shares enough specific detail with it to suggest a common source tradition. The Hindu Matsya Purana describes a world-destroying flood survived by a single righteous man warned by a divine fish. The Ojibwe people of the Great Lakes region have a flood narrative. The Andean cultures of South America have flood narratives. The Aboriginal Australians, whose oral traditions Nunn and Reed studied, have flood narratives, and in their case, those narratives have been shown to contain verifiable geographical data about actual sea level changes. One theory suggests that the global distribution of flood mythology reflects a common underlying historical experience. The rapid, dramatic sea level rise of the early Holocene period between approximately 9000 and 6000 BCE, during which coastlines worldwide retreated inland by significant distances, submerging the coastal lands where, as this documentary has argued, a disproportionate share of human settlement was concentrated. In this reading, the flood myths are not allegory. They are not moral instruction wrapped in supernatural narrative, though they may have accumulated those functions over time. At their core, they are the oldest news reports in human history, accounts of something that actually happened, preserved in the only medium available to the people who witnessed it: spoken language. Living memory, the human voice passing a true thing forward through time, generation by generation, in the dark, across thousands of years. What Patrick Nunn and Nicholas Reed's work established, quietly and with the precision of matched geographical coordinates, is that this process works better than we assumed, not perfectly, not without distortion or embellishment or the gradual accumulation of symbolic meaning that makes ancient stories difficult to parse as literal accounts, but well enough that a specific bay that disappeared beneath the rising ocean 9,000 years ago can still be identified in the words of a story told today by the descendants of the people who watched it flood. The ancient world did not only record what it knew in stone, it recorded what it knew in breath, in voice, in the specific cadence of a story told correctly, in the right season, by the right person, to the right listeners. Listeners who understood that they were not just hearing a story, they were carrying something forward, something that needed to reach a time when there would finally be instruments precise enough and minds careful enough to recognize what it was. There is a particular kind of intellectual honesty that is harder to practice than it sounds. It is the honesty of sitting with an incomplete picture and resisting the twin temptations that an incomplete picture always produces. The first temptation is to fill the gaps with certainty, to reach for a theory that makes everything cohere, that turns the fragments into a complete story, that gives the mystery a satisfying resolution even when the evidence does not fully support one. The second temptation is the opposite, to retreat into a skepticism so comprehensive that the genuine anomalies get dismissed along with the fabricated ones, and the real questions get buried under the reasonable ones. This documentary has tried to walk the narrow path between those two failures. Now, at the end of that walk, it is time to draw together what the evidence actually shows and to be equally precise about what it does not. Here is what we know. We know that 17,000 years ago, people living in the Dordogne Valley of southwestern France were entering deep cave systems by firelight and painting images on the walls with a technical sophistication and artistic confidence that implies long-established traditions of visual representation, accumulated craft knowledge, and, if Michael Rappengluck's analysis of the astronomical encoding at Lascaux is even partially correct, systematic observation of the night sky across generations. We know that 11,600 years ago, before agriculture had taken hold in the region, before any settlement of equivalent social complexity is documented anywhere in the Near East, a community of people in what is now southeastern Turkey quarried, shaped, transported, and erected multi-ton limestone pillars arranged in precise geometric patterns, covered with detailed animal reliefs, at a site that was later deliberately buried, and that still, after decades of excavation, has yielded less than 5% of its total extent to the archaeologist's trowel. We know that somewhere around 12,800 years ago, something happened that cooled the northern hemisphere by 10 to 15 degrees. Within approximately a decade, collapsed multiple megafauna species across multiple continents, ended the Clovis cultural tradition in North America, and left a thin but geologically consistent layer of impact markers. Nanodiamonds, magnetic spherules, elevated platinum concentrations across more than 50 sites on 6 continents. Whether the primary mechanism was an extraterrestrial impact or airburst, an ocean circulation disruption, or some combination of triggering events remains an open scientific question. That something catastrophic and geologically anomalous occurred at that moment is not seriously disputed. We know that around 100 BCE, in the eastern Mediterranean world, craftsmen working within a tradition that Cicero described as associated with Archimedes produced a bronze analog computing device of such mechanical sophistication that nothing of equivalent complexity appears in the surviving record for the next 14 centuries, and that this device, recovered from a shipwreck off the island of Antikythera, currently resides in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, where anyone can see it. We know that around 400 CE, ironworkers in Gupta period India produced a wrought iron pillar using a forge welding technique and a specific iron phosphorus composition that has kept it structurally intact, standing in open air in northern India for 1,600 years, and that the corrosion-resistant properties of the material were not deliberately replicated by modern metallurgy until the 20th century. We know that Aboriginal Australian oral traditions have been shown, by peer-reviewed research published in the Journal of Archaeological Science, to preserve accurate geographical descriptions of coastlines that were submerged by rising sea levels between 7,000 and 10,000 years ago. These are not theories. They are not speculations. They are documented, peer-reviewed, physically verifiable facts, and taken together, they describe a pattern that the standard narrative of human, technological, and cognitive development, the slow, linear climb from stone tools to cities to science, does not comfortably accommodate. Here is what we do not know. We do not know whether the astronomical encoding at Lascaux represents a systematic tradition of observational astronomy extending across the Upper Paleolithic period, or a pattern that a contemporary researcher has identified in images whose original meaning was entirely different. We do not know what lies in the 95% of Göbekli Tepe that has not been excavated, what dates the unexcavated structures will return when they are finally reached, or what the relationship between Göbekli Tepe and the 11 other Taş Tepeler sites in the Şanlıurfa region ultimately reveals about the social and cosmological world of Neolithic Anatolia. We do not know what specific tools and techniques produced the manufacturing tolerances documented at the Serapeum of Saqqara, the polygonal masonry of Sacsayhuaman, and the H-block stonework of Pumapunku, or whether the answer to that question, when it is finally established through experimental archaeology, will require revision of existing models of ancient technical capability. We do not know whether the Younger Dryas event represents a catastrophic interruption of a trajectory of human technological development that was, at the moment of interruption, more advanced than the surviving post-Younger Dryas record suggests, or whether the discontinuities in the ancient record reflect the ordinary, non-catastrophic processes of cultural change, population, movement, and selective preservation that archaeologists routinely work with. We do not know what is on the seafloor beneath the continental shelves of the world's oceans, in the regions that were dry land during the last glacial maximum. We have surveyed a fraction of it. The fraction we have surveyed has already returned significant findings. The fraction we have not surveyed is vastly larger. Here is what comes next. At Karahan Tepe in southeastern Turkey, Necmi Karul and his team at Istanbul University are continuing to excavate a site that has already produced findings: the human figures emerging from bedrock, the evidence of a skull cult, the architectural parallels with and divergences from Göbekli Tepe that are reshaping the understanding of the broader Taş Tepeler tradition. Each season of excavation produces new data. The site will be generating significant findings for decades. At Sangxingdui, in Sichuan province, China, archaeologists have been excavating since 2021, a series of new sacrificial pits that have yielded bronze masks, gold foil objects, ivory, and silk fragments belonging to a Bronze Age culture that had no written language and left no historical record in the texts of neighbouring civilizations. A culture of extraordinary artistic sophistication, whose origins and connections remain poorly understood. The Sangxingdui findings are ongoing and have not yet been fully analysed or published. In the Amazon basin, LiDAR surveys conducted by researchers affiliated with the University of Exeter and published in 2018 revealed a network of pre-Columbian earthworks, geometric enclosures, raised causeways, settlement mounds, covering an area of approximately 13,000 square kilometres in what is now the Brazilian state of Mato Grosso. The Amazon, long assumed to have been too ecologically challenging to support large, complex pre-Columbian societies, is revealing itself to have been densely inhabited and extensively modified by human activity for thousands of years before European contact. Ancient DNA research, led by researchers including David Reich at Harvard University and S.K. Willerslev at the University of Cambridge, is producing a revolution in the understanding of prehistoric human population movements, that is, as disruptive to existing models as any of the physical sites discussed in this documentary. Reich's 2018 book Who We Are and How We Got Here documents a pattern of ancient human migration, admixture, and population replacement that is substantially more complex than the models that dominated the field a generation ago, and that raises questions about the transmission of technical knowledge across population boundaries that have not yet been systematically addressed. Ian Tattersall, the paleoanthropologist at the American Museum of Natural History, who has spent decades studying the origins of human cognition, has argued in multiple publications that the cognitive capacities that make human beings capable of symbolic thought, language, art, and complex technical reasoning were fully in place long before the behavioral record shows them being consistently exercised. The biological hardware, in Tattersall's framework, preceded the behavioral software by a significant margin. One theory suggests that what the anomalies in this documentary represent the cave paintings, the precision masonry, the astronomical encoding, the analog computer, the corrosion-resistant metallurgy are not evidence of a lost civilization in the dramatic, singular sense that popular culture favors. They are evidence of something more distributed and more interesting. They are the scattered, surviving outputs of human cognitive capability being exercised in various times and places and cultural contexts at levels that the standard narrative consistently underestimates, because the standard narrative is built from the surviving record, and the surviving record is not a representative sample of what existed. What gets preserved is hard, durable, and lucky. What gets lost is organic, transmitted, and fragile. The stone survives, the voice does not, and we have been building our picture of the ancient mind from the stone. Every generation of archaeologists has discovered that the previous generation underestimated ancient humanity. The generation that dismissed Altamira's paintings as modern forgeries was succeeded by a generation that recognized them as 35,000-year-old masterworks. The generation that placed the beginning of complex ceremonial behavior at the dawn of agriculture was succeeded by a generation that found Göbekli Tepe. The generation that assumed the Amazon was a pristine wilderness, untouched by large-scale human organization, was succeeded by a generation with LiDAR. There is no reason, none, supported by the evidence to believe that the current generation is the first to have gotten the picture right. The picture is still being assembled, piece by piece, site by site, season by season, in the patient, methodical, occasionally thrilling, and occasionally frustrating way that the actual work of archaeology proceeds far from the dramatic reveals of television, far from the confident pronouncements of either institutional consensus or conspiratorial counter-narrative. The picture is incomplete, and the parts that are missing are not small. At the end of this journey through the frozen Alps and the jungle canopy, and the cave in the Dordogne and the buried hill in Turkey, and the seafloor and the ancient stones, and the oral traditions that carried true things forward across 10,000 years of unwritten time, what remains is not a conclusion. What remains is a question, rephrased, not whether ancient humans were capable of more than we have given them credit for. The evidence answers that, but what it meant to them, what they understood themselves to be doing when they carried pigment into the depths of the earth, or gathered across a landscape to raise a stone that weighed more than anything any single one of them could move. What they were trying to preserve or communicate, what they knew that we have not yet been quiet enough, or careful enough, or humble enough to hear. The answer to that question is still out there, slowly, undisturbed, waiting beneath the surface of the world, in the dark,